Picture this. You're a merchant in 12th century China, and you've just sold a shipment of silk that's worth about 1,000 copper coins. Great news, right? Wrong. Those coins weigh roughly 60 pounds. That's like carrying 3 bags of concrete just to pay for dinner. And if you want to buy something really expensive, say a house, you'd need a whole cart full of bronze coins that would probably weigh more than the house itself. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was killing trade across the Song dynasty. Merchants were literally breaking their backs trying to move money around, and the government was running out of copper to mint enough coins. Something had to give, and what gave us was something absolutely revolutionary: the world's first government-issued paper money. But here's the crazy part. This wasn't some accident or lucky discovery. The Song dynasty created an entire industrial system to mass-produce paper currency, complete with anti-counterfeiting measures that would make modern security experts jealous. We're talking about massive printing bureaus with hundreds of workers, secret fiber recipes, and punishment systems so harsh that even thinking about counterfeiting could get you killed. These weren't just pieces of paper with numbers on them. They were technological marvels that required precision engineering, artistic skill, and bureaucratic genius all rolled into one. The Chinese basically invented the concept of trusting a piece of paper instead of actual metal, and they did it 800 years before most of the world even considered the idea. But getting to that point was a journey filled with copper shortages, merchant rebellions, and enough bureaucratic drama to make a soap opera writer jealous. The story starts with a crisis that was literally weighing down an entire empire. By 1100, the Song dynasty was facing what we might call the Great Copper Crunch. They needed more coins than ever before because their economy was booming like crazy. Trade routes stretched from Korea to Southeast Asia. Cities were growing faster than bamboo after rain, and everyone wanted to buy and sell everything. The problem was simple math with devastating consequences. The government was minting about 5 billion copper coins every year. That's billion with a B, but it still wasn't enough. Imagine trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose while someone's drilling holes in the bottom. That's basically what the Song monetary system looked like. Merchants started hoarding coins, which made the shortage even worse. Some regions had plenty of copper cash, while others were practically running on the barter system. The weight issue was getting ridiculous too. A decent-sized business transaction required so many coins that you'd need a team of porters just to count your money. One historical account mentions a grain dealer who hired 6 men just to transport his daily earnings to the bank. 6 men. For money transport, it was like having an armed guard for your wallet, except your wallet weighed as much as a small horse. But here's where it gets interesting, and slightly illegal. Enterprising merchants in Sichuan province started creating their own solution around 1024. They began issuing what they called jiaozi, which literally means exchange medium. These were basically IOUs, but fancy ones. Instead of carrying around 50 pounds of copper, you could deposit your coins with a trusted merchant and get a piece of paper that proved you had credit. When you wanted to buy something, you'd hand over the paper, and the seller could later exchange it for actual coins. This was brilliant in its simplicity. But it had one tiny problem. It was completely unregulated. Some merchants started issuing more jiaozi than they had coins to back them up. Others would mysteriously disappear right around the time people wanted to redeem their notes. It was like the Wild West, except instead of gunfights, people were having paper fights. The whole system was teetering on the edge of collapse when something unexpected happened. The government decided to get involved. Emperor Renzong's court looked at this chaos and had a thought that would change world history. What if we controlled this paper money thing ourselves? In 1160, instead of shutting down the jiaozi system, they decided to formalize it. They created official printing bureaus, standardized the notes, and backed them with the full authority of the imperial government. It was like taking a bunch of neighborhood lemonade stands and turning them into Coca-Cola. The decision wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival. The Song dynasty was fighting wars on multiple fronts, and moving military payroll in copper coins was becoming logistically impossible. Imagine trying to pay 100,000 soldiers with coins that weigh more than their armor. Paper money meant armies could be paid faster, supplies could be purchased more efficiently, and the whole war machine could run smoother than ever before. But creating a government paper money system wasn't just about printing some fancy certificates and calling it a day. The Song bureaucrats had to solve problems that no one in human history had ever faced before. How do you make paper that won't fall apart after a few transactions? How do you prevent counterfeiting when your money is literally made of the same stuff as regular paper? How do you convince people to trust something that has no intrinsic value? The answers to these questions led to the creation of what were essentially money factories. Massive printing bureaus that operated with the precision of Swiss watchmakers and the security of military installations. These weren't quaint little workshops with a few scribes copying characters by hand. We're talking about industrial operations that could produce thousands of notes per day, each one a masterpiece of engineering and artistry. The main printing bureau in Kaifeng, the Song capital, employed over 400 people working in carefully coordinated shifts. There were papermakers who knew secret recipes for creating durable note stock, engravers who could carve woodblocks with microscopic precision, and security officials whose entire job was making sure no one walked out with unauthorized printing materials. It was like a medieval version of the US Bureau of Engraving and Printing, except with more silk robes and fewer coffee breaks. The whole operation was divided into specialized departments, each with its own role in the money-making process. The fiber preparation room was where they turned raw materials into the special paper stock that would become currency. The engraving workshop was where master craftsmen created the printing blocks that would give each note its unique design. The press hall was where the actual printing happened, with workers operating under strict supervision to ensure quality and prevent theft. But the real genius of the system was in the details. The anti-counterfeiting measures that made Song paper money nearly impossible to forge. We're talking about security features that wouldn't look out of place on modern banknotes. Special fibers that could only be sourced from specific regions, unique inks that required secret formulas, and printing techniques that took years to master. They even had serial numbers and official seals applied by multiple government officials, creating a paper trail that made every single note traceable. The denominations were carefully calculated too. The most common notes were worth about 1,000 copper coins, enough to handle serious transactions, but not so valuable that losing one would bankrupt a family. Higher denominations went up to 10,000 coins worth, which was serious money even by today's standards. Each denomination had its own distinct design, size, and color scheme, making it easy to tell them apart even for people who couldn't read. The printing process itself was a marvel of medieval engineering. Each note required multiple printing passes to achieve the final design. First came the base pattern, usually printed in black ink from carefully carved wood blocks. Then came the colored elements, red seals, blue borders, sometimes gold accents for the highest denominations. Each color required a separate printing pass, which meant a single note might be handled by a dozen different workers before it was complete. Quality control was obsessive. Every batch of notes was counted multiple times, checked for printing defects, and examined by supervisors who could spot even minor flaws. Notes that didn't meet standards were destroyed immediately, burned in special ceremonies that were witnessed by multiple officials to prevent any possibility of defective currency entering circulation. They took quality control so seriously that workers could be punished for producing notes with uneven ink coverage or slightly crooked printing. The storage and distribution systems were equally sophisticated. Completed notes were stored in heavily guarded treasuries, sorted by denomination and tracked in detailed ledgers. When it came time to distribute new currency, the notes were packed in sealed containers and transported under armed guard to regional treasuries throughout the empire. Each shipment came with paperwork detailing exactly how many notes of each denomination were included, creating an audit trail that accountants today would recognize. Provincial governors had specific quotas for how much paper money they could put into circulation, and exceeding those limits required special authorization from the capital. It was like having a central bank 600 years before anyone invented the concept of central banking. The whole system was designed to prevent the kind of overissuance that could lead to inflation and economic chaos. But perhaps most importantly, the government made sure people would actually use these paper notes. They declared that all taxes could be paid with paper money, which immediately created demand for the currency. Government employees were paid in paper notes, and official transactions were conducted using the new system. It was like announcing that your new video game currency was now legal tender. Suddenly, everyone needed to get their hands on it. Money changers played a crucial role in making the system work smoothly. These were licensed professionals who could exchange paper notes for copper coins and vice versa, usually for a small fee. They operated in markets, ports, and commercial districts, making it easy for merchants and ordinary citizens to convert between different types of money as needed. Some even offered currency exchange services for people traveling between regions that used different denominations or note series. The exchange system created some fascinating economic dynamics. Merchants quickly learned that paper money from certain printing bureaus was more trusted than others. Notes from the main Kaifeng facility were considered gold standard, while some regional bureaus had reputations for lower quality printing or less stringent security measures. It was like having different brands of currency, each with its own street credibility. Smart traders would actually seek out the most prestigious notes for important transactions, knowing that everyone would accept them without question. Meanwhile, notes from less reputable bureaus might trade at a slight discount, even though they were theoretically worth the same amount. The government tried to prevent this by standardizing designs and moving supervisors between different printing facilities. But market psychology is a stubborn thing. The redemption system was where things got really interesting and really complicated. Unlike modern paper money that you can theoretically use forever, Song banknotes came with expiration dates. Most notes were valid for about 3 years, after which they had to be exchanged for new ones at government treasuries. This wasn't just bureaucratic nonsense. It was a clever way to control money supply and prevent the accumulation of worn-out currency that might be easier to counterfeit. The redemption process was like a medieval version of renewing your driver's license, except the consequences of letting your money expire were a bit more serious than getting a traffic ticket. Citizens had to bring their old notes to designated treasury offices, where officials would examine each note carefully, verify its authenticity, and issue fresh currency in exchange. The old notes were then ceremonially burned in public bonfires, creating quite a spectacle that probably attracted crowds like a medieval fireworks show. These burn ceremonies served multiple purposes beyond just destroying old currency. They were public demonstrations of the government's commitment to maintaining the money supply, reassuring people that the system was being properly managed. They also prevented old notes from circulating past their expiration dates, which could have led to confusion and potential fraud. Plus, there's something oddly satisfying about watching money literally go up in smoke, even if it's not yours. The whole expiration system created its own mini-economy of deadline panic. As notes approached their expiration dates, you'd see people rushing to treasury offices like students cramming for finals. Some enterprising individuals made decent livings as redemption specialists, helping elderly or illiterate citizens navigate the bureaucratic process for a small fee. Others would buy up nearly expired notes at a discount from people who couldn't be bothered with the redemption hassle, then redeem them for full value. But the Song dynasty's paper money system had a fatal flaw that would eventually bring it crashing down: the temptation to print more money when the government needed quick cash. And boy, did they need cash. Wars against the Jin dynasty in the north and various rebellions throughout the empire were draining the imperial treasury faster than a bathtub with no plug. The math was seductively simple. Why raise taxes and make people angry when you could just print more money and make your problems disappear. It worked great at first. Soldiers got paid, supplies were purchased, and the war machine kept running. But economics has a way of catching up with wishful thinking, and the Song dynasty was about to learn a lesson that governments are still learning today. Printing more money doesn't actually create more wealth. By 1180, the government was issuing paper money at rates that would make a modern central banker break out in cold sweats. Some provinces were circulating 10 times as much paper currency as they had copper coins to back it up. Regional governors, desperate to fund their military campaigns, started ignoring the quotas set by the central government. It was like having a credit card with no spending limit, fun while it lasted, but the bill eventually comes due. The first signs of trouble showed up in the markets. Merchants started demanding more paper notes for the same goods, sensing that something wasn't quite right with the money supply. A bag of rice that used to cost 1 paper note suddenly required 2 notes, then 3. People began hoarding copper coins again, figuring that metal was more trustworthy than government promises. The very problem that paper money was supposed to solve, coin shortages, came back with a vengeance. Different regions started experiencing wildly different inflation rates, creating economic chaos that made trade between provinces nearly impossible. A merchant traveling from Sichuan to Jiangnan might find that his paper money had half its purchasing power by the time he arrived. Some clever traders figured out these price gaps and made fortunes by essentially arbitraging currency across regions, but this just made the system even more unstable. The government tried various fixes that mostly made things worse. They issued new series of notes with different designs, hoping that fresh currency would restore confidence. They created exchange rates between different note series that changed so frequently that merchants needed daily updates just to know what their money was worth. Some regions tried to return to copper-only transactions, but there still weren't enough coins to go around. The counterfeiting situation exploded during this period of monetary chaos. When the government's own printing bureaus were cranking out notes like a medieval photocopier gone mad, the difference between official currency and fake currency became increasingly academic. Some counterfeit operations were so sophisticated that their notes were actually higher quality than the rushed production coming from overwhelmed government facilities. The penalties for counterfeiting remained brutal. Death by slow slicing for the main perpetrators, exile for accomplices, and property confiscation for their families. But when your government-issued money is losing value every week, the risk-reward calculation starts looking different. Historical records mention several cases where entire villages were involved in counterfeiting operations, suggesting that ordinary people were getting desperate enough to risk everything for a chance at economic survival. Quality control at the printing bureaus started breaking down under the pressure to produce more notes faster. The careful attention to detail that had made Song paper money so trustworthy gave way to rushed production schedules and corner cutting. Notes started appearing with uneven printing, inconsistent paper quality, and security features that were easier to forge. It was like watching a Swiss watch factory try to compete with a deadline-driven assembly line. Something important was bound to get lost in the process. The social consequences were devastating. Families who had saved money in paper notes watched their life savings evaporate like morning mist. Merchants who had built their businesses around paper transactions found themselves unable to trust the very currency that had made their success possible. The elderly and illiterate, who had the hardest time keeping track of changing exchange rates and note series, were hit particularly hard. Some regions tried to implement their own solutions, creating local currency systems that operated parallel to the official paper money. These ranged from sophisticated credit networks run by merchant associations to simple barter systems that bypassed money entirely. It was like watching the monetary system fragment back into the regional chaos that paper money had originally been designed to solve. The government's attempts at reform came too late and too half-heartedly to restore confidence. They tried implementing stricter quotas on note issuance, but local officials ignored them when faced with immediate military needs. They attempted to recall certain note series and replace them with new ones backed by higher reserves, but people had learned not to trust government promises about currency backing. By 1200, the paper money system that had been the pride of the Song dynasty was limping along on life support. It still functioned in some regions and for some transactions, but the universal trust that had made it revolutionary was gone. The great experiment in paper currency had taught the world both the possibilities and the perils of money that existed purely as a government promise. Yet even as the system struggled with its internal contradictions and over-issuance problems, its influence was already spreading beyond China's borders. Mongol merchants who had dealt with Song paper money carried the concept back to their own territories. When the Yuan dynasty eventually conquered the Song, they would adapt and refine the paper money system, creating their own version called Chao that would last for decades. The technical innovations pioneered by the Song printing bureaus would influence currency design for centuries to come. The use of special fibers, multiple printing passes, serial numbers, and official seals became standard features of paper money worldwide. Even the redemption and expiration systems would be echoed in later currency experiments, though usually with modifications based on the hard lessons learned from the Song experience. The merchants who first started trading with Mongol territories noticed something fascinating about their business dealings. These nomadic traders had been watching Chinese paper money operations for decades, taking mental notes about everything from printing techniques to distribution systems. When Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty, one of his first major policy decisions was creating his own version of paper currency, the Chao, that borrowed heavily from Song innovations while fixing some of their most obvious problems. The Yuan Chao system was like Song paper money's bigger, tougher older brother. They kept the basic printing bureau structure but added layers of oversight that would have made Song administrators weep with envy. Multiple officials had to sign off on every batch of notes, regional quotas were enforced with military precision, and the penalties for unauthorized printing made the Song punishments look like gentle suggestions. When the Mongols did something, they didn't mess around, but the real genius was in how they handled the backing system. Instead of promising to exchange paper notes for copper coins, a promise that had proven impossible to keep during wartime, the Yuan government declared that their paper money was legal tender for all transactions, period. No exchanges, no redemptions, no expiration dates. It was like announcing that poker chips were now the only acceptable currency in Las Vegas, except the casino was an entire empire and everyone had to play along. This might sound like monetary tyranny, and in many ways it was, but it worked surprisingly well for several decades. The Yuan had military power to enforce their currency decisions, extensive trade networks that created natural demand for standardized money, and enough economic stability to make people trust government promises, at least initially. Their paper money became so successful that it inspired similar systems throughout their vast empire, from Korea to Central Asia. European travelers who encountered Yuan paper money were absolutely baffled by the concept. Marco Polo's famous account of Chinese currency reads like someone trying to explain smartphones to medieval peasants. He kept emphasizing that these pieces of paper were treated exactly like gold, as if his readers would assume he was making up fairy tales about magical money trees. His descriptions of the printing bureaus and security measures were so detailed that some historians think he might have been taking notes for potential counterfeiting operations back home. The influence of Chinese paper money extended far beyond the Mongol Empire, though. Islamic merchants who traded along the Silk Road carried stories about paper currency back to the Middle East, where scholars debated whether such money could be considered legitimate under Islamic law. Some argued that money without intrinsic value was essentially fraud, while others pointed out that any medium of exchange accepted by the community was valid currency. These debates would continue for centuries and influence how Islamic societies approached paper money when it eventually reached their territories. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Song paper money system wasn't its direct influence on other currencies. It was the economic lessons it taught about monetary policy. The Song dynasty had essentially conducted the world's first large-scale experiment in fiat currency, and the results were both promising and terrifying. They proved that paper money could revolutionize trade and economic efficiency when properly managed, but they also demonstrated how quickly monetary systems could collapse when governments couldn't resist the temptation to print their way out of problems. The technical innovations developed in those Song printing bureaus became the foundation for virtually every paper currency system that followed. The concept of denominations, the use of serial numbers, the application of multiple security features, even the basic layout of information on currency notes. All of these elements can be traced back to those medieval Chinese workshops. Modern banknotes are essentially high-tech versions of Song jiaozi, printed with lasers instead of woodblocks, but following design principles that were established 800 years ago. The bureaucratic structures created to manage paper money also had lasting influence. The idea of a central authority controlling money supply, regional distribution quotas, quality control standards, and anti-counterfeiting enforcement became standard features of national monetary systems worldwide. Even today's central banks operate on organizational principles that would be recognizable to Song dynasty treasury officials, though they probably have better coffee and definitely have air conditioning. The economic theories that developed from studying Song paper money helped shape how later societies understood inflation, currency backing, and monetary policy. European economists in the 17th and 18th centuries were still referencing Chinese currency experiments when debating the merits of different monetary systems. Adam Smith's discussions of money and credit in The Wealth of Nations show clear influence from accounts of Chinese paper currency, even though he was writing 600 years after the Song dynasty fell. Perhaps most significantly, the Song experiment demonstrated that successful paper money required more than just printing technology and government authority. It needed public trust, economic stability, and disciplined monetary policy. These weren't just technical challenges, but social and political ones. A government might be able to force people to accept paper money in the short term, but long-term success required convincing entire populations to believe in the value of government promises. The psychological aspects of paper money adoption turned out to be just as important as the physical security features. The Song dynasty learned that currency design mattered for public acceptance. Notes had to look official and valuable, even if they were made from relatively cheap materials. The ceremonies around note issuance and redemption weren't just bureaucratic procedures, but public relations exercises designed to reinforce confidence in the monetary system. The social disruptions caused by Song monetary policy also provided early warnings about how currency instability could affect different groups unequally. The elderly, the poor, and people in rural areas were hit hardest by inflation and currency devaluation, creating social tensions that sometimes exploded into outright rebellion. Later governments would study these patterns when designing their own monetary systems, though many would repeat similar mistakes anyway. The international trade implications were equally significant. The Song dynasty's paper money system made long-distance commerce dramatically more efficient, but it also created new forms of economic vulnerability. Currency exchange rates became crucial factors in international trade, and governments had to develop sophisticated policies for managing how their paper money was valued relative to other forms of currency. These challenges would become even more complex as paper money spread to other regions with their own monetary systems. The environmental impact of paper money production was also noteworthy, though it probably wasn't intentional. The Song printing bureaus required enormous quantities of specific plant fibers, special inks, and wood for printing blocks. This created entire industries devoted to supplying currency production, from fiber farming to ink manufacturing to specialized woodworking. Some regions became economically dependent on supplying materials for money production, creating economic relationships that persisted long after particular note series were discontinued. The military implications of paper money were equally profound. The Song dynasty's ability to quickly mobilize resources for warfare was dramatically enhanced by their paper currency system, but this same system made them vulnerable to economic warfare. Enemies could potentially destabilize the Song economy by counterfeiting their currency or disrupting their printing operations. This led to new forms of strategic thinking about economic security that influenced military planning for centuries. The educational requirements for managing paper money systems also had broader social effects. The Song printing bureaus needed workers with specialized skills in mathematics, artistic design, quality control, and administrative procedures. This created demand for education and training programs that helped spread literacy and technical knowledge throughout Chinese society. Some historians argue that the paper money system contributed to China's technological advancement by requiring higher levels of education and skill among ordinary workers. The records and documentation systems developed for tracking paper money also had lasting influence on Chinese bureaucracy. The need to account for every note produced, distributed, and redeemed created unprecedented levels of record keeping that influenced how the government managed other administrative functions. These documentation systems became models for later bureaucratic innovations and helped establish standards for official record keeping that persisted well into the modern era. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Song paper money experiment was how quickly it transformed from a practical solution to a specific problem into a fundamental restructuring of how entire societies thought about value, exchange, and economic relationships. Within a few decades, concepts that had seemed impossible, trusting pieces of paper as money, accepting government promises as valuable assets, conducting major transactions without physical commodities, became normal parts of daily life for millions of people. The speed of this transformation suggests something important about human adaptability and social learning. Once people saw the practical advantages of paper money, lighter weight, easier storage, more convenient transactions, they were willing to overcome their initial skepticism and embrace a completely new way of thinking about money. This pattern would repeat throughout history as paper currency spread to other regions, suggesting that the benefits of efficient monetary systems can overcome even deeply ingrained cultural preferences for traditional forms of money. The Song dynasty's paper money system ultimately failed, not because the concept was flawed, but because the government couldn't resist the temptation to abuse their monetary printing power. This lesson would be learned and forgotten repeatedly by governments throughout history, from the hyperinflation disasters of 20th century Germany and Zimbabwe to more recent concerns about quantitative easing and digital currency creation. The fundamental challenge identified by the Song experience, balancing the benefits of flexible money supply with the need for monetary discipline, remains one of the central problems in modern economics. The legacy of those Song dynasty printing bureaus extends far beyond the medieval world they created. Every time you tap your card at a coffee shop or check your bank balance on your phone, you're participating in a system of trust that was first established in those heavily guarded courtyards of 12th century China. The idea that money could exist as pure information, backed only by institutional promises, seemed absolutely insane to most of the world for centuries after the Song experiment ended. But here's the thing that would blow the minds of those original jiaozi merchants. Modern digital currency makes their paper money look positively primitive. We've gone from trusting government-issued pieces of special paper to trusting numbers stored on computer servers scattered across the globe. The progression from copper coins to paper notes to digital bits represents the same fundamental shift in human thinking. The gradual acceptance that money doesn't need to be a physical thing you can hold, as long as everyone agrees it has value. The technical challenges that kept Song officials awake at night, preventing counterfeiting, tracking money supply, ensuring public trust, are still the core problems that central banks and financial institutions grapple with today. The difference is that instead of woodblock carvers and seal stampers, We have cryptographic algorithms and blockchain verification systems. Same problems, fancier solutions. What's truly remarkable is how the Song dynasty managed to solve these challenges using medieval technology. They created serial numbers when most of the world was still struggling with basic arithmetic. They implemented quality control systems that would make modern manufacturers proud. They developed distribution networks that spanned thousands of miles, all coordinated through handwritten ledgers and horseback messengers. It was like building a smartphone using stone tools. Technically impossible, yet they somehow pulled it off. The psychological breakthrough was perhaps even more impressive than the technical achievement. Convincing millions of people to abandon thousands of years of monetary tradition required a level of social engineering that most governments today couldn't accomplish with focus groups, advertising campaigns, and social media manipulation. The Song bureaucrats had to change how an entire civilization thought about value and exchange, using nothing but carefully crafted paper and bureaucratic theatre. The ripple effects of this monetary revolution are still spreading today. Every paper bill in your wallet carries DNA from those original jiaozi designs. Every central bank policy decision echoes debates that first raged in Song dynasty treasury meetings. Every discussion about cryptocurrency and digital payments is essentially a continuation of conversations that started in those medieval printing bureaus about what money really means and how much we should trust our governments to manage it. The Song dynasty proved that humans could adapt to completely new forms of money faster than anyone expected, but they also demonstrated the devastating consequences when monetary systems lose public trust. Their experience serves as both inspiration and warning for modern economies still wrestling with the same fundamental questions. How much money is too much money? Who gets to decide what money is worth? And what happens when everyone stops believing in the system at the same time? Those questions matter more today than ever before, as digital currencies and artificial intelligence threaten to revolutionize money once again. The Song dynasty's thousand-year-old experiment in paper promises might just hold the key to understanding where our monetary future is headed, and what we need to learn from history to avoid repeating its most expensive mistakes.